Chapter 16, Incorporating Best Practices to Build the Program Design Narrative. In this chapter, reminding funders why they're reading your application, writing your goals and SMART objectives, creating accountability that links throughout the rest of your narrative, developing a logic model to connect the dots, proving accountability with an evaluation plan. The program design section of the grant application is by far the most important narrative section in your grant proposal. It's the section that divides the I don't have a clue grant writers from the I have this in the bag grant writers. The coaching and examples in this chapter show you how to write an award-winning program design section that's all about your vision, as in the positive changes you'll bring about when your proposal wins that grant award. Reviewing the components of a good program design section. The program design section is where you roll out all the promising details about what will happen when the bucks are in place to actually create, implement, and evaluate your grant-funded program. The program design narrative shows funders that you have a well-documented project implementation and evaluation plan. To write a successful program design section, you need to be optimistic yet realistic and include the following main ingredients in this order: a purpose statement, a one-sentence, direct explanation of why you're seeking funds. Goals, where your program or constituency aims to be when the grant funds are used up. There are two types of goals, outcome-focused and SMART. I give you examples of both later in this chapter. SMART objectives, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound benchmarks or specific steps that lead to the accomplishment of your goals. I describe SMART objectives in the later Plotting Goals on SMART Objectives section. An implementation plan with process objectives and timelines, a plan listing the activities, process objectives, required to meet and exceed your measurable objectives and when they will be implemented. A logic model with an impact objective. Your logic model lays out a graphic roadmap with inputs, strategies, outputs, and outcomes. Adding an impact objective reflects the long-term benefit, 7 to 10 years, you believe your program will have on your target population and/or community. Evaluation shows how you'll track the progress of the project's objectives, what data collection tools you'll use to gather information about the project, and who will conduct the evaluation. This section screams accountability. Some grant applications may ask you to include evaluation plans separately, in a section following the program design or even in an attachment. However, many public and private sector funders are realizing the importance of having you, the grant applicant, integrate your evaluation plan into the program design. Your entire program design must give the grant reviewers a detailed explanation of the big picture. In other words, you must lay out each section as though you were placing the pieces into a large puzzle. The large puzzle is your program design, and the pieces are each of the elements in the preceding lists. Starting with a purpose statement. As the first part of your program design narrative, the purpose statement tells the grant reader why you're asking for grant monies. You have two types of purpose statements to choose from, direct and indirect. A direct purpose statement includes the amount of the requested grant award. Remember that even when you mention a dollar amount, the purpose statement shouldn't exceed one sentence. Get to the point and tell the grant reader the purpose of the grant request and the amount of funds needed. Use the following example as a guide for writing your own direct purpose statement. The Grant Writing Training Foundation is seeking your initial and ongoing financial support in the amount of $40,000 for its 5-day public health-focused grant writing boot camp in Johannesburg, South Africa. An indirect purpose statement simply tells the reader the purpose of the grant requests, a program or project in need of funding. The example that follows shows you how an indirect purpose statement should read. The purpose of this request is to seek grant funding to conduct a 5-day Johannesburg campus-based residential grant writing training program for ministers of public health from 23 African countries. I prefer to use a direct purpose statement in foundation and corporate funding requests because it more efficiently gets to the point for the reader who will make the final funding decisions. However, I use the indirect purpose statement for government grant proposals because government grant peer reviewers don't make those same final decisions. An agency staff person with authority over the grant-making initiative does. Therefore, no actual amount of money is requested should appear in the purpose statement of government funding requests. Plotting goals on SMART objectives. The first road mapping tools in your program design narrative are goals, intent, and objectives. What, how much, when, for whom, and how your measurements will be proven. Your program's goals address the big picture success of your program, and the objectives are the measurable ways, or benchmarks, you plan to reach those goals. Funding agencies view measurable steps as signs of accountability, showing how their money will make an impact on the problem, and your organization's capability to solve the problem. Always provide objectives for each goal and each year for which you're requesting funds for an activity. The following sections help you differentiate between goals and objectives, craft goals worthy of funding, and design objectives that fit within the three classic types. Whether you're new to grant writing or you've submitted a few grant applications in your day, I strongly suggest you review the first of these sections. After multiple year-long stints as a grant application peer reviewer, I rated applications from school districts, colleges and universities, and non-profit organizations that had received grant awards for years, and they all were very weak in the goals and objectives section. Most important, grant reviewers rarely recommend applications for funding that have weak goals and objectives. Write smartly to score well. Understanding the difference between types of goals and objectives. To keep the terms goal and objective straight, think of goal first and remember that it's the thing you're attempting to accomplish. A goal is where you are when you're done implementing the activities associated with your measurable objectives. Grant application narratives must have goals to show the funder that you have a vision for solving the problem. A lot of things have changed since I first started writing grant writing for dummies. Roll your mind back to 2001. Back then, I trained everyone in my grant writing classes that goals are never measurable. However, over the past 2 decades, there has been a shift among some public sector, government, and private sector, foundation and corporation, funders. Some of these grant makers are now asking for measurable goals. I know, it's a bit confusing to all grant writers. To alleviate any confusion, I provide definitions and examples of a traditional goal and a SMART goal. Recall that SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Okay, so what about an objective? An objective is simply a major milestone or checkpoint or benchmark on your route to reaching a goal. It's a place where you can say, and report to a funder, if necessary, we've come this far, and we have this far remaining before we reach the goal. Award-winning objectives are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound, SMART. They also serve to keep goals realistic. When writing a government grant request, develop your goals by using the funder's goals for the funding initiative. Always follow the funder's directions as to what type of goal they want to see in grant applications, non-measurable or measurable. Then create measurable objectives to track all the funding initiatives' intended outcomes, also known as performance measures. Everything you need to cue you on how many goals and how many objectives to write is there in the grant application guidelines. On the other end of the spectrum, when you're writing a proposal to a foundation or corporation, you have nothing to tip you off to what the funder wants to see or fund in terms of funder goals and objectives. In those cases, keep it light and usually write 1 or 2 non-measurable goals. And each goal should always have 1 or 2 measurable or SMART objectives. That said, when I am writing, I don't have a magic number for goals and objectives. Just be sure your organization's goals are based on the vision of where you want the program or target population to be when the grant period is over. Your goals need to align with the goals of the funding. This verbiage will be provided on the funder's website or in its grant application guidelines. Following the funder's directions to write the right types of goals. There are 2 types of goals, non-measurable and measurable. Always read the funder's guidelines carefully and write the types of goals that it asks for. When you're in the process of writing any type of goal, be sure to write clear, concise, 1-sentence statements. Non-measurable goals should be action-oriented and full of verbs. See Chapter 12 for more on choosing impactful words. Measurable goals are written much like SMART objectives. I always start my non-measurable goals with the word provide until I get into a rhythm. After I have the magic non-measurable goal language machine going, I venture out and use other starting action words such as develop, plan, educate, create, build, empower, engage, and so forth. Non-measurable goals truly mirror SMART objectives. To be sure you've written effective and well-constructed goal statements of any type, ask yourself the following questions. Did I follow the funder's guidelines for writing the right type of goal, non-measurable or measurable? Did I use 1 sentence? Is the sentence clear and concise? Do my goals align with the funder's priority areas and program-specific goals for awarding grants? Does the grant reader know who the target population is and where the monies are needed? Geographic impact area. Following are examples of both types of goals, non-measurable and measurable. I advise only using one goal writing format in your grant application. In other words, don't mix non-measurable and measurable goals. Write one or the other, depending on the funder's specific guidelines for what it wants to see in your narrative. Here are some examples of non-measurable goals. Goal: provide elderly disabled residents with supervised physical fitness activities offered inside of their gated community. Goal: develop an obesity awareness campaign targeting Latino families residing in Denver, Colorado. Goal: create a women's business center incubator in Goodyear, Arizona, to train recent parolees from the state prison system in micro-enterprise entrepreneurship. Here are some examples of SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound goals. SMART goal: by the second quarter of year 1, elderly disabled residents will increase their levels of physical activity in multi-level community-based exercise sessions by 25% as measured by pre- and post-declining health indicators. SMART goal: by the third quarter of year 1, create and carry out 13 weekly obesity awareness campaigns targeting 50% or more of Latino families residing in Denver, Colorado, as measured by the number of broadcast media stars in Spanish. SMART goal: by the end of year 1, complete 100% of the Women's Business Center incubator in Goodyear, Arizona, to facilitate micro-enterprise entrepreneurship training programs targeting recent parolees from the state prison system as measured by the number of building inspections passed, the number of months to complete the facility, and the number of post-parole agreements with regional correctional facilities. If the funding decision-maker can't look at your goals and figure out from them what your entire program is about, you've failed to write clearly stated goals, measurable or non-measurable. When you start writing your program design, remember to incorporate keywords and phrases from the grant announcement's purpose of funding statement. During the grant review process, this strategy helps peer reviewers make a clear connection between the purpose of the grant and your statement of need and program design, which should fit like a soft leather glove to the announcement language. This approach of parroting the funding agency's own words results in receiving higher review points, starting you down the road to getting a funding award. Just make sure your target population fits the one described in the purpose of funding statement. Recognizing and writing types of objectives requested by funders. Successful grant writing requires you to understand the 3 types of objectives, also known as milestones or benchmarks, and to know when to use them: SMART objectives, measurable steps or benchmarks to reach a stated goal; process objectives, activities or tasks; impact objectives, benefits to end users that continue after the grant funding has ended. Using the right objective at the right time can help you rack up peer review points, which can also help you win big bucks for your program. See Chapter 11 for further insight on the review process. SMART goals, explained earlier in this chapter, do not mix with SMART objectives. Why? When funders require SMART goals, they simply want goals written like SMART objectives. There will be a measurement term, like increased or decreased, without any time-bound or time-frame language. These types of measurable objectives are merely performance indicators. I give you some examples later in this chapter. Although you should definitely provide at least one objective for each goal and year of your funding request, some program designs have more than one objective for each goal. If this setup is the case with your design, make sure that you number and alphabetize the objectives, for example, 1A, 1B, 1C, and so on, to eliminate confusion for the reviewer. Creating SMART objectives. How do you recognize a SMART objective? It's an objective that shows how the goal will be accomplished. Always create SMART objectives for your programs or projects. They're the most common type of objectives funders ask for in their grant application guidelines. When writing your own SMART objectives, use phrases that imply some sort of measurable change, such as to increase or to decrease. For example, you can write about an increase of 50% in the number of organizations receiving project services by the end of year 1. The easiest way to write measurable objectives is to use the SMART acronym. S is the objective specific rather than abstract. The objective must point out who will benefit, students, patients, clients, or whatever applies, and specify what will be measured. behavior, participation, and so forth. M. Is the objective measurable? Can it be tracked easily with valid measurement tools, such as surveys, pre- and post-needs assessments, and more? Use measure indicating words such as increase, decrease, reduce, improve, lower, or raise. Also include a percentage benchmark. You can't write, by the end of year 1, hire 10 teachers, because that doesn't specifically illustrate a measurable benefit to your target population. A. Is the objective attainable? Can your organization really pull off the objective within the time frame of the grant award? R. Is the objective realistic? Can the measurement actually be reached for the target population in the given time frame? T. Is the objective time-bound? Can your organization accomplish all the required tasks to achieve the objective in the given time frame? Make sure your objective contains a time-bound phrase, such as by the end of year 1, or the first semester, the second quarter, the grant funding period, or whatever time segment your project will occur in. The following are some sample SMART objectives for Goal 1, a non-measurable goal. In the examples in the earlier section following the funder's directions to write the right types of goals, provide elderly disabled residents with supervised physical fitness activities offered inside of their gated community. SMART Objective 1A. By the end of year 1, increase the number of residents inquiring about fitness events in the community room by 25% or more as demonstrated by pre-grant and post-grant award comparisons of incidences of interest among the target population. SMART Objective 1B. By the end of year 1, increase the number of residents participating in one or more fitness activities by 25% or more as demonstrated by pre-grant and post-grant event attendance records. SMART Objective 1C. By the end of year 2, increase the number of residents participating in 2 or more fitness activities by 50% or more over year 1 as demonstrated by a comparison of year 1 and year 2 event attendance records. In order to accurately measure any percentage increases for your target population, like measurements built into the example objectives, you need to know the baseline numbers, the starting point, for each type of measurement. For example, if the home has 300 elderly residents, how many are participating in fitness activities at the time you're writing the grant request? You need a starting point in order to establish a reasonable, attainable measurement. If you don't have baseline data, write that in the program design narrative. Explain to the funder that your data collection will include a pre- and post-assessment of the high-risk indicators to demonstrate that your intervention implementation strategies did work. If the program you're requesting funding for is new, you may not have baseline data to help guide the development of SMART objective targets, such as the percentage of charge you estimate will occur. In this case, be sure to build baseline assessments into the program enrollment process whenever possible. Why do I like to include the term or more in my SMART objective statements? Because if you meet or exceed conservative objectives, you'll look like a superhero in the eyes of the funder. On the other hand, if you set overly ambitious objectives and fail to meet them, you'll look like someone who didn't know how to collect baseline numbers or indicators for each SMART objective, and you probably won't be refunded by that funder. Producing process objectives. Process objectives are the implementation-related activities or tasks needed to reach your goals and meet or exceed your SMART objectives for your grant-funded program. For effective process objectives, write about the actual, chronological activities that need to occur from the time you receive grant funding until the monies have been spent. The best way to present your process objectives is in a table format. Make sure to follow the funder's guidelines when setting up your timeline segments, which I explain in the upcoming section providing a comprehensive implementation plan. I like to use quarters, however, some funders ask for monthly timelines for all activities when writing process objectives. Quantify your activities in numbers rather than percentages or words. Following are 2 sample process objectives. Process Objective 1, Marketing Outreach to 300 Elderly Residents. Process Objective 2, Enroll 75 elderly residents in 1 or more fitness activities. Identifying impact objectives. Impact objectives demonstrate the achievement of the goal of the project or program when you or anyone else steps into the future and then looks back at what was accomplished and the differences that were made. In other words, what will the grant's impact on your target population be in 3 to 5 years? If you come across a grant application in which the funding agency asks you to write about benefits to participants, respond by using impact objectives. Benefits to participants are really presumptions of how the funded program's intervention will change your participants. For example, you can write about changes in the target population's attitude about learning and achieving. Impact objectives are easy to identify because they're written in past tense. They're futuristic glimpses into the past, your vision for what the program's future impact may be. Unlike process objectives, you don't have any common words to cue your writing. The funder is just looking for signs of significant change brought on by the interventions that the funder made possible. Here is an example of an effective impact objective. Impact objective: residents who participated in Year 1 of the fitness activities have reported lower incidence of hypertension and a reduction in chronic disease progression. Providing a comprehensive implementation plan. A timeline or Gantt chart tells the grant reader when major project milestones will begin and end during the grant's funding period, which is usually a 12-month period. The timeline also included information about who's accountable for each activity and how you'll evaluate the program's accomplishments during that period. When you develop a project timeline, keep in mind that the grant reader wants to see answers to the following questions. What are the key tasks or activities that will be carried out to implement the program successfully? Did the grant applicant include all tasks, from the day funding is announced or awarded to the last day of the project's funding time frame? Can each task realistically begin and end in the proposed time frame? Are evaluation activities included in the timeline chart? Who is responsible for seeing that each activity is implemented and completed? You can use your word processing software to create a simple timeline chart. Just be sure not to overdo it with color, use no more than 4 shading selections, and don't use red or black shading unless you change the font color to white. Because I never know how many disruptions and malfunctions I'll encounter in implementing a grant-funded program, I prefer to set up my activity start and stop dates in quarterly increments. However, if you have total control over the activities, you can use monthly increments to show when they begin and end. The sample activity timeline chart in Figure 16-1 clearly shows what the program plans to accomplish, when it plans to accomplish it, and who is responsible for seeing the activities, process objectives, through the completion phase. You can access a timeline chart template at www.dummies.com/geo/grantwritingfd7e. For programs that request funding for multiple years, you need to include extra timelines in the grant application showing each year's activities and the quarterly timeframes for each activity. You can either create a multi-year timeline chart on one page that breaks down the 4 quarters for each year, do so in landscape format to make room for all the information, or create a separate timeline chart for each year. Figure 16-1 shows Year 1 for the fitness program. Years 2 and 3 would take another 2 pages of table charts. Whether you choose to set up a multi-year landscape table chart or individual year charts that take up 2 or more pages depends on the funder's page limitations. Illustration by Ryan Sneed. Figure 16-1, an example of a timeline of activities. Confirming narrative content connectivity in your logic model. The logic model is a graphic blueprint of the key elements of a proposed program. It looks at inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. If you live and work in the world of grants, avoiding the logic model is difficult. Just about every type of funder seems to want you to include a logic model in the program design of your grant application and narrative. Here's what the columns of your logic model graphic should contain. Inputs: these are the human, financial, and physical resources dedicated to your grant-funded program. These resources include money, staff and staff time, volunteers and volunteer time, facilities, equipment, supplies, and community partners. See Chapter 17 for information on personnel and organization resources. Strategies: these are what your program uses to organize the inputs. Using effective strategies helps the program to fulfill its mission. Basically, the funder wants a recap of your goals. I copy and paste the goals I wrote in the program design into this column of the logic model. Simplify your SMART goal, if that type of goal is required by the funder, and take out any measurement language. Outputs: these are the direct results of your program's implementation activities. They're actually written as indicators of productivity. Outputs usually start with the phrase number of and reflect how you'll quantitatively track your program activities. You can extract output language from your objectives narrative, found earlier in your program design, and from your evaluation narrative as well. Short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, these are the benchmarks or measurements for your target population during and after program activities. For the outcomes, you can simply reuse your SMART objectives or SMART goals, extracting the measurements language only. See the earlier section plotting goals on SMART objectives. Some funders want to see short-term outcomes, 3-month SMART objective measurements, and others want to see intermediate outcomes, 6-month SMART objective measurements. All funders want to see long-term outcomes, 12 months or longer SMART objective measurements. Long-term impact or impact statement. Funders want to know what long-term outcomes or impact, changes in systems and processes after the funding is expended, you anticipate for your target population. Figure 16-2 shows the basic structure for the logic model with intermediate and long-term SMART objectives. Keep in mind, though, that this is only one example of how funders may instruct you to prepare your logic model form. I provide a template of the logic model format at www.dummies.com/geo/grantwritingfd7e. Illustration by Ryan Sneed. Figure 16-2, the logic model depicts your organization's planned work and intended results for a given project. If you have a multiple-year program, you need to have multiple-year logic models. Each year's model should show a set of inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts on its own page. Also, if the funder has its own logic model format, forms, or different components, follow those. The logic model isn't a process you can pick up overnight. But reviewing the online materials at the W.K. Kellogg website, www.wkkf.org, can help with the learning curve. Search the internet for Logic Model Development Guide and download the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Development Guide from the Show All Results menu. I suggest printing it out and using it as a desktop reference. Writing the evaluation plan for your program design. The most important part of grant writing is the initial step for deciding which grants to pursue, but evaluating your project after it has been funded is a close second. The evaluation plan in the program design section of the grant narrative explains to the potential funder how you plan to evaluate the success of your project. The evaluation plan includes a review of your program's objectives and how you'll know whether you met them. The type of information you'll collect to use in the evaluation. How often you will collect the information. Who will collect the information? Who will analyze the information and report the results? To introduce you to the evaluation process, I explain evaluation terms and the types of evaluations your organization can perform in the following sections. I also show you how to put together an evaluation plan for your program design and how to write a dissemination plan. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation has published a handbook describing how to actually go about conducting an evaluation. You can view or download the handbook on the Foundation's website, www.wkkf.org, by searching for Evaluation Handbook. Making sense of evaluation plan terminology. Before you can write an evaluation plan, you need to have a basic understanding of the commonly used terms. The terms in the following sections are ones you should be familiar with and use when writing your evaluation plan for the program design. Data collection and analysis. You collect data in order to find out whether you're achieving the objectives you describe in the project design section of your grant narrative. You analyze the data to determine whether you met your goals. Both the data collection and analysis processes must be objective, no matter what the findings reveal. Data is the information about your project gathered using measurement tools. Measurement tools can include surveys, pre- and post-questionnaires or tests, and oral interviews. Data analysis occurs when you examine the information that you collect with the measurement tools. What you're looking for is whether the data produces information relevant to determining the progress of your project. If it isn't, you need to go back and design new measurement tools. Understanding evaluation standards. Evaluation standards are acceptable ways to measure various components of your project. The American National Standards Institute approved the following 4 nationally used standards in the 1990s. The entire evaluation process should incorporate these standards if you want funders and others in your field to accept your findings as valid. Accuracy standards are how you plan to show that your evaluation will reveal and convey technically adequate or sufficient information about your project. Feasibility standards are how you plan to ensure that your evaluation procedures will be realistic, prudent, diplomatic, and frugal. Propriety standards are how you plan to show that your evaluation will be conducted legally, ethically, and with due regard for the welfare of those involved in the evaluation as well as those affected by its results. Utility standards are how you plan to evaluate the information and needs of the project's participants or end users evaluators. The evaluator or evaluation team is the individual or group of people you select to determine whether your project succeeded or failed in meeting its goals. Even if your project failed miserably, for example, your objectives said that, on average, 75% of the participants would gain 1 full grade point, but only 25% did so, you and your stakeholders, including the funders, need to know what went wrong and how the outcome could be reversed. Sometimes in this failed scenario, your funding source will actually give you a second grant to fix the problem, which equates to another chance to succeed. But you get the second chance only if your evaluation team is objective and accurate. A third-party evaluator is an individual or company outside your program that designs and conducts your project's evaluation. See taking the third-party evaluation route later in this chapter for more information. Remember to include an expense line in your project's budget to compensate the third-party evaluator for its services. The standard amount to set aside for evaluation is 15% of your total project budget. See Chapter 18 for more about budgets. An internal evaluation occurs when you decide not to hire an outsider to conduct your evaluation and instead choose to gather stakeholders to assess the effectiveness of your program. See the latest section Keeping the evaluation process in-house. You shouldn't evaluate your own project. You can be a part of the evaluation team if you decide to conduct an internal evaluation. However, refrain from coaching or coercing other evaluation team members, your co-workers, board members, volunteers, community members, or project participants. Everyone on the evaluation team needs to be able to talk openly about their perceptions of the data findings. Focus on being impartial. Types of evaluations. There are 2 basic types of evaluations, formative and summative. This section discusses both. A formative evaluation occurs when you sit down with the project stakeholders, community members, participants, and staff, and develop a list of questions the funders may ask about your project when determining whether the funding was well placed and used. Looking at several aspects of the project design, goals, objectives, and activities, stakeholders generate questions about how the project can become more effective or efficient. The formative process continues from the time you receive grant funding to the completion of the grant time frame. In light of this ongoing process, you should set a frequency for when the data will be collected to answer the questions you have posed. Some funders give you due dates for evaluation and financial reports. Others leave the reporting frequency up to the grant applicant or grantee. If the latter is the case, I recommend giving quarterly reports, at a minimum, to all your funders. When you report quarterly, you find flaws or weaknesses in your program's implementation strategies quickly and have time to correct them. Well within the funding period, always have progress reports or raw data, information collected but not compiled into summary form or typed in a formal report, on hand for funder queries or visits if you can't make improvements to your project. That is, if your students just aren't improving their grade point averages as quickly as you anticipated in your program design narrative, a formative evaluation may not be the right approach to measure the success of your project. Instead, focus on using a summative evaluation. The summative evaluation, also called an outcome evaluation, occurs near or at the end of the period for which you are funded. This type of evaluation should answer the following questions in a narrative format. What did you accomplish? How many participants were impacted and in what ways? What overall difference did your project make? Is this project worth funding again? Qualitative versus quantitative. Qualitative evaluation describes the approach you take when you want to understand the quality of your project's implementation process. You can use surveys and focus groups to determine the quality of the service delivery process, staff development training, partnership involvement, and other components of your program. Quantitative evaluation, tracking the numbers, describes the approach you take to measure the progress of your SMART objectives. Did you reach your short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes as presented in the logic model? See the earlier related section. I like to collect data on both qualitative and quantitative approaches in order to analyze the progress and impact of the implementation process. Keeping the evaluation process in-house. When you plan to conduct an internal evaluation, meaning you aren't hiring an outsider to assist with or conduct the evaluation of your project, the best option is to propose a stakeholders evaluation in the evaluation plan of your program design. In a stakeholders evaluation, you don't need to identify the evaluators until you know your project is funded. You can then identify select stakeholders from your target population, board of directors, and community partners to sit on the evaluation team. The easiest way to identify your project stakeholders is to ask yourself the following question: who has a vested interest in our project and will be impacted by the project's success? The outcome of the project definitely matters to your board of directors, if you have one, as well as to the staff assigned to work on the project. However, it matters most to the project's target population, which is why you should seriously consider inviting some of them onto the evaluation team. A clue as to when you may need to propose a stakeholders evaluation can be found in the grant application's budget instructions. If the budget instructions for the grant or cooperative agreement don't include a specific line item for evaluation or contracted services, and if your program implementation costs will require all the available grant funding, I suggest you consider a stakeholders evaluation. It's less costly and keeps the entire evaluation process local and manageable. For example, suppose your organization proposes to operate a homeless shelter for veterans returning from overseas combat. The grantor requires that all proposed homeless prevention plans originate from the feedback collected at public meetings. At your public meetings, have a sign-in sheet that captures each attendee's name, mailing address, telephone number, and email address, as well as whether the person is a veteran or has a family member who's a veteran or on active duty. Each and every citizen who attends your public meeting and provides input on the need for housing for homeless veterans is a potential candidate for the evaluation team. Be creative and bring together people who have different perspectives. Sometimes, opposing views bring out additional needs that weren't identified during the public meetings. Having one or two devil's advocates on any team, including the evaluation team, can be good for flushing out the real needs and forcing team members to rethink their positions. The number of people you have on your stakeholders evaluation team doesn't matter as long as everyone's point of view is welcomed, considered, and incorporated into your final intervention or prevention methodology for serving the target population. Do you have board members who have wanted to work with your organization in a more hands-on way but who you're afraid will try to micromanage the program? Placing them on the evaluation team is an ideal way to divert their energy. They can really help shape the outcome of your grant-funded program, a program that may very well be the most important part of your organization. When it comes to an internal evaluation team, you are not looking for groupthink. You want independent-minded people who can bring objective ideas to the table, giving you a credible evaluation process for your funded project. Also, remember that if you use your staff for the evaluation, they'll need time to oversee the data collection, interpretation, and reporting processes. In other words, the evaluation process will cost money and/or time whether you decide to use internal or external evaluators. Taking the third-party evaluation route. If you decide to bring in an outsider to conduct your evaluation, that person is referred to as a third-party evaluator in the grant narrative. Even though outside evaluators are costly, some need up to 15% of your total project budget to conduct the evaluation. The right outside evaluator can bring credibility and visibility to your project, which in turn attracts continued funding. The grant application's budget instructions often provide clues that you need an outside evaluator. If the budget instructions discuss evaluation costs and ask you to provide information on third-party evaluators, plan to bring in an outside evaluator. To find a qualified evaluator, first ask other organizations in your community that provide programs similar to yours about evaluators they've used. Their evaluator may have been a university research department, a college faculty member, or a retired government employee with expertise in the project area. However, be aware that you may have to look outside your home area for an evaluator. You must choose an individual or organization that has experience in developing evaluation plans, creating monitoring guidelines that track the progress of a project's objectives, and conducting both simple and complex evaluations in the project's focus area. During your telephone conversation or meeting with the prospective evaluator, work through a list of prepared questions and write down the evaluator's answers. You may have to decide from among several possible candidates, and having the answers on paper will help you review and make your decision. Keep in mind that the evaluator will need sufficient information about the program's design to respond intelligently to your questions. Start off with the following questions. What methodology will you use to understand the day-to-day operations of my project? How much time will the work take, and how much will it cost? How many on-site days can you provide in order to meet with project personnel and talk to representatives from the target population? Are you willing to meet with my board of directors to provide progress reports on the evaluation? At what points will you give me written evaluation reports? Brainstorm with your staff to come up with even more questions. Selecting an evaluator is an important part of your project, and falling short in writing this part of the narrative can result in being denied funding. After you select an evaluator, see whether that organization or person can help you write the evaluation plan for the grant narrative. Of course, you may have to pay a fee for the evaluator's time, but the money is well spent if you're going after a multi-million-dollar, multi-year grant with heavy competition, when fewer than 10 grants will be awarded nationwide in a major grant competition. That's what I call heavy, and make sure you write this same evaluator into your budget to bring that person or group back for the full evaluation process when you have a funding award. See Chapter 18 for more on how to incorporate the cost for post-grant award evaluation into your project budget. Writing the evaluation plan. After you decide whether to conduct an internal stakeholder or external third-party evaluation, the next step is to start writing or incorporating your evaluation plan into the program design section of the grant application narrative. The evaluation plan goes at the end of the program design narrative if it's not a standalone section. The funder's formatting guidelines usually determine the length of each narrative section in the grant proposal. The program design is usually the largest section, so write succinctly but included sufficient details for the funder to see you have a comprehensive evaluation plan. Your evaluation plan must always be written to address the funding agency's guidelines. A comprehensive evaluation plan includes a narrative on how the program will be evaluated, qualitatively, quantitatively, or both. It also tells the funder what type of data will be collected, who will be collecting, analyzing, and interpreting the data, and the frequency for the data collection process. Don't forget to add detail about each target population included in the evaluation process and tell how information or data will be collected from them, by way of survey, questionnaire, visual observation, and more. Most importantly, make sure all data to be collected is connected to determining your progress toward achieving your measurable objectives, which are presented earlier in the project design section of your application. And remember that your evaluation plan must be specific to your program goals and objectives. Examples of evaluation plans abound online. If you do an internet search for sample evaluation plan, you find that just about every type of funder, foundation and government has posted outlines and full narrative sections of its best or preferred type of evaluation plans. Don't forget to use the Kellogg Foundation's website to search for and use its logic model development process information. The evaluation plan also needs to include information about how you'll share your evaluation findings with other organizations interested in replicating a successful model program. This sharing process is called dissemination. The dissemination plan, which is usually a paragraph or two, is written at the end of the evaluation plan. Worried about giving away too many secrets? Don't be. When you receive a grant award, the funders expect you to share your findings with other organizations and associations. With government grants, everything you do, information and program activities, is subject to public access. Foundation and corporate funders want to maximize their investments, which means you're obligated to disseminate your evaluation findings. Practically all funders ask for your dissemination plans in their grant application guidelines. When you write your dissemination narrative, include information on what you'll share and how you'll share it. List conferences, forums, website postings, and printed documents mailed out, and to whom they'll be mailed. When you're writing your grant applications, always follow the guidelines provided for preparing your narrative sections. In foundation funding requests, the dissemination plan can be short and to the point. However, in government funding requests, You may be instructed to write multiple pages on the dissemination process. Carefully reading and following the funding agency's guidelines can be the difference between a funded project and a rejected one.